The silence of midnight was shattered by a single broadcast, one the world wasn't prepared for. Buckingham Palace, in a rare, unfiltered statement, confirmed a devastating development that would forever alter the face of the British monarchy. No smiles, no royal balcony, just a cold announcement that something had gone terribly wrong. The words echoed across continents, but the pain behind them could only be understood inside the palace walls. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At exactly 12:01 a.m., the Royal Press Office released a statement so brief, so chillingly void of emotion that it sent shock waves across every corner of the globe. It is with deep sorrow that the royal household confirms a significant development within the monarchy. Further details will follow. 18 words, no names, no explanation, just silence and then chaos. There was no grand stage, no royal figure standing tall behind the insignia of the crown. This time it wasn't a sovereign who spoke to the world. It was a spokesperson, a man unknown to most, now etched into history for being the bearer of the monarchy's most tragic declaration in decades. He stood stiff, avoided eye contact with the camera, and walked off before anyone could ask a single question. That in itself was a message. Speculation ignited instantly. Social media platforms went into overdrive. Was it a death in the family, a royal collapse, an abdication, or something even more catastrophic? Something that would rip open a wound the crown had spent years trying to heal? People didn't just want answers, they demanded them. Behind palace gates, the story was even more harrowing. An anonymous senior aide leaked that the announcement was the result of a relentless 9-hour emergency meeting held earlier that day inside Windsor Castle. Phones were confiscated. No notes were allowed. What was said in that room was meant to stay there until it didn't. At one point during the meeting, Princess Anne arrived through a rarely used side entrance. Witnesses reported her expression was cold, almost unreadable, and she did not exchange words with anyone before joining the private council. Her presence signaled gravity, and does not attend internal royal sessions unless the family is on the brink of internal rupture. And yet, the most glaring absence of all was Queen Camilla. Her seat at the table remained empty, and that absence didn't go unnoticed. It was the kind of silence that roared louder than any public statement. Some believed she refused to be present. Others whispered that she was intentionally excluded. Either way, it fueled rumors of fracture, of something darker unfolding within the royal structure. As press outlets scrambled for clarity, insiders described a palace consumed by turmoil. Frantic staff ran messages between corridors. Lights stayed on in the private quarters long past dawn. Someone even reported hearing shouting behind closed doors. The kind of shouting not meant for public ears. Something had detonated at the heart of the monarchy. The consequences still unfolding were already too late to contain. But to understand the weight of this announcement, we must go back to the days before this storm where quiet choices built into irreversible consequences. What the public didn't see was the frantic whispering inside the palace corridors. For 4 days, aides moved like ghosts. Security was heightened and private cars came and went through rear gates. A storm was brewing. And it wasn't just political, something personal, something unspeakable. And the countdown had begun. Behind the polished exterior of Buckingham Palace, chaos simmered like a kettle about to scream. It started subtly, too subtle for most to notice. Princess Catherine abruptly led an engagement meant to celebrate one of her long-standing patronages. No explanation, no reschedule, just silence. And that silence sent alarm bells through the tightly controlled network of royal observers who knew this wasn't Catherine's way. She doesn't withdraw unless something is seriously wrong. Then came the sightings, fleeting, hushed, unconfirmed. King Charles, known for his meticulous schedule, began holding back-to-back meetings with Prince William, often behind locked doors, sometimes twice a day, sometimes well past midnight. No aides were permitted inside, not even senior ones, only Charles and William. Whatever was being said wasn't meant to be heard. And in a monarchy where words are guarded like crown jewels, that was terrifying. It got stranger. A cryptic message appeared briefly on the royal family's official website. Just a single line. "We are with you." No context, no attached image. Within 8 minutes, it vanished. But not before sharp-eyed users captured it and blasted it across social media. Who was we? Who was you? And what exactly had just happened? The next day, the palace's internal security systems were tested and not for routine maintenance. According to insiders, cyber analysts from government intelligence were brought in discreetly to sweep royal communications. Something had leaked or was about to. And the monarchy, always slow to trust outside interference, allowed this invasion only because the stakes were no longer reputational. They were existential. Inside the palace, emotions ran dangerously high. Queen Camilla was reportedly seen leaving a closed-door discussion with red eyes and trembling hands. Some claimed she shouted during the meeting. Others said she was begged to remain calm. But one thing became clear. She wasn't in control of the situation, and that realization shattered her composure. For someone who had spent years climbing to the center of royal power, losing grip now must have felt like free fall. Royal staff, usually the first line of stability, were rattled. Internal memos instructed them to brace for a wave of public response and to rehearse neutral talking points in case of confrontation. Staff were reminded that should they be approached by press, friends, or even family, they were to give nothing, no expressions, no statements, no reactions. It wasn't just panic anymore. It was preparation for impact. And while palace walls shook in secrecy, the heart of the storm lay in the most unlikely place, Prince Louis. Prince Louis had always been the crown's quiet soul, the one protected from media warfare. But what no one knew until now was that behind his smiles and playful photos, a heartbreaking battle was being fought. One that left even King Charles at a loss for words. Behind palace doors, far from flashing cameras and ceremonial appearances, Louis had been quietly admitted to a private medical facility under a false name. The operation was so covert that even some senior royals remained unaware. The choice was deliberate. Prince William and Princess Catherine, desperate to shield their youngest from the circus of speculation, took matters into their own hands. The child they once cradled during balcony waves was now behind locked doors, surrounded by specialists flown in from Zurich under diplomatic escort. At first, the official explanation was a wellness check, a routine evaluation. But inside documents tell a different story. Louis wasn't undergoing observation. He was undergoing crisis care. His condition, cloaked in medical ambiguity, was reportedly linked to a rare disorder carried through a dormant royal bloodline. It was something the family thought had vanished generations ago. But it hadn't, and it had returned in the most devastating form. The initial signs were dismissed. Occasional fatigue, erratic sleep, moments of speech regression. But as the episodes became more frequent, so did the panic. William, usually composed even in the worst of times, was said to have personally driven Louis to the hospital's rear gate. Catherine followed, clutching paperwork, speaking to no one. This wasn't just medical management. It was a full-scale intervention disguised as a ghost operation. 4 days. They waited in silence. The Crown offered no comment. The palace calendar continued as though nothing had changed. But inside the king's private chapel, something broke. According to a longtime footman, Charles was found kneeling alone one evening, clutching a file labeled PLW. His sobs echoed through the stained glass sanctuary. It was the sound of helplessness, a monarch forced to confront something he could neither rule nor rescue. What tore him apart wasn't just the diagnosis. It was the knowledge that the truth had been hidden from him for so long. Not out of malice, but out of desperation. William and Catherine hadn't meant to deceive. They simply didn't know who to trust anymore. With leaks emerging from even the most trusted circles, the risk of exposure had grown too great. And then on the third night of Louis' hospital stay, a nurse discovered something folded beneath the child's pillow. A sealed envelope with careful handwriting. On the front, it read, "My Lottie and George. If I forget, you remember for me." No one opened it. No one dared. But the weight of it was enough to silence even the most hardened aides. It wasn't just paper. It was a cry for remembrance in the face of fading memory. But the secret that broke Charles wasn't just Louis' condition. It was how Camilla responded to it behind closed doors. In a room filled with grief, one whisper shattered the last thread of royal unity. Queen Camilla, believing herself unheard, made a comment so cutting, so dismissive, it ignited a firestorm that tore the family in two. And that whisper, it didn't stay hidden for long. It happened during what was meant to be a closed-door strategy meeting. The inner circle had gathered to quietly discuss the growing crisis around Prince Louis, carefully balancing medical privacy with looming public exposure. Tensions were already razor-thin. William hadn't slept in 2 days. Catherine hadn't spoken publicly in nearly a week. Charles sat silently, flanked by advisors, reading over the latest health updates with shaking hands. The atmosphere was thick with sorrow. And then came the whisper that broke everything. Camilla leaned toward a longtime aide, her voice hushed but sharp. "This has become a public distraction," she said. "We can't halt the institution for a boy's cold spell." The words were cold, casual, careless. But what she hadn't realized what would cost her dearly was that Princess Anne was standing just behind the door, and heard every syllable. The confrontation was immediate. Anne didn't pause. She entered the room, eyes locked on Camilla, and with a voice that reportedly stopped even Charles mid-breath, she said, "You are unfit for the crown. If you can't show loyalty to a child in pain, you've no place wearing the robes of the family he belongs to." The room fell silent, not out of shock, but recognition. Someone had finally said what others had only dared to think. But it didn't stop there. William, already stretched to the breaking point, erupted. Witnesses say he stood, hands trembling, and shouted, "Enough," before storming out. One aide claimed he slammed the heavy oak doors behind him so hard the portraits in the hallway shook. In that moment, William wasn't the heir. He was a father, a brother, a son, and he had just watched the institution he was meant to inherit fail the people it was supposed to protect. The fallout was swift. Charles, though no stranger to internal royal tempests, was deeply shaken. For the next 3 days, he refused to speak to Camilla. Meals were taken separately. Schedules were rewritten. Behind the walls of Buckingham, a chasm had opened, one that no crown or ceremony could close. The royal office responded in quiet yet unmistakable terms. Camilla's upcoming appearances, charity galas, hospital visits, a diplomatic luncheon in Scotland were all postponed due to schedule revisions. But insiders knew better. It was a freeze-out. A message that even the Queen Consort wasn't untouchable. In a last-ditch effort to de-escalate the tension, Camilla's daughter attempted to reach out to Kensington Palace. She was turned away at the gates. No entry, no exceptions. The family that once tolerated polite distance had now installed an emotional blockade, and the message was clear. Something sacred had been broken. With tensions now erupting, the king made a decision no one saw coming. One that would bring both mourning and justice into the spotlight. He didn't issue it with fanfare, no cameras, no procession, just ink, trembling fingers, and a silent room. King Charles signed the most devastating royal decree since the abdication of Edward VII, one that would forever change the family tree and fracture public perception. It was called Article Windsor Alpha, a title chosen for its quiet force, calculated, deliberate, and final. The document didn't scream its intent. It didn't need to. The content spoke louder than any speech the monarch had ever given. In a few concise paragraphs, it realigned the succession, redrew the boundaries of power, and signaled that even bloodlines had limits. Several names, once honored, once celebrated, were struck from the list of active successors, not erased entirely, but removed from influence, from direct claim. It wasn't exile, it was containment. For Prince Louis, the decree introduced something both protective and painful. A new layer of guardianship, a royal oversight board was formed quietly. Its purpose to monitor his medical progression and shield him from press exploitation. While it wasn't framed as an emergency measure, everyone inside the palace knew what it meant. This wasn't just oversight. It was preparation for a future the family hoped would never arrive. But the clause that made headlines, the one whispered across royal circles like a sudden wind, was this: Camilla's duties as queen consort were to be suspended indefinitely pending internal reconciliation. It was phrased with careful neutrality, but the meaning was unmistakable. Her reign for now had stopped. Not due to scandal, not yet, but because of fracture. The crown could not afford to be seen fractured and unified in the same breath. Simultaneously, royal legal teams were dispatched to enforce another silent strike. Meghan's branding empire, built carefully around titles, emblems, and royal identity, was served notice. No further use of crests. No more stylized duchess in promotional content. Not even an indirect implication of endorsement. The message was clear. The House of Windsor was taking back its name. And then came the words that would be etched into royal history. Charles signed the decree with 6 strokes of a fountain pen and paused before writing his final note at the bottom. Not as punishment, as protection. Those 6 words revealed everything. His heartbreak, his rationale, his restraint. It wasn't about revenge. It was about shielding what little remained of an institution already strained to its limits. The witnesses were few, but carefully chosen. Princess Anne, the monarchy's iron spine. Lady Louise, the next generation's quiet torchbearer, and the Archbishop of Canterbury to lend the moment spiritual gravity. No media, no press office, no official photographs, just 3 people and a king, and the sound of history folding in on itself. But the royal decree was only the beginning. The fallout would unfold in public view, where silence was no longer an option. By dawn, London wasn't just awake, it was on edge. Thousands gathered outside Buckingham Palace, clutching signs, candles, and questions. News stations buzzed. Social media exploded. The monarchy, for the first time in decades, stood at the edge of rebellion, its people demanding answers. What began as murmurs online turned into a full-blown national outcry. The media, starved of official statements and sensing blood in the water, ran with the most devastating theory imaginable. That a royal death had occurred and was being hidden. Headlines screamed speculation. Tragedy at Windsor. The prince's last days. Buckingham goes silent. Without facts, hysteria filled the vacuum. And at the center of that hysteria was a name, Prince Louis. Fuel was thrown on the fire when leaked footage emerged online. A grainy, shaky clip taken outside a private hospital. It showed Princess Catherine stepping into a black vehicle, her face buried in her hands, visibly shaken. Aides tried to shield her, but it was too late. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. The woman often hailed as the monarchy's unbreakable compass looked broken, and the world took notice. By mid-morning, hashtags had overtaken every major platform. Number Save trended across the globe. Number Monarchy in Crisis reached millions within an hour. Celebrities, politicians, even foreign leaders began issuing statements of concern. This wasn't a palace matter anymore. It was a global moment, and the institution built on discretion was now being dragged unwillingly into the court of public opinion. The crowd outside the palace grew by the minute. Some came with flowers. Others came with fury. Signs held high read, "Where is Camilla? Tell us the truth." And enough with the silence. The royal guards remained in formation, but their expressions betrayed the unease beneath the surface. This wasn't ceremony. This was crisis. In a move that defied protocol and surprised even those closest to her, Princess Beatrice stepped through the gates. She wasn't meant to. No royal was. But something in her had snapped. She approached a woman sobbing near the front of the crowd and, according to witnesses, placed her hand gently on the woman's shoulder and whispered, "His loved. His strong." It was the only royal acknowledgement that something had gone horribly wrong, and it electrified the crowd. Inside the palace, alarms were raised. Security was immediately doubled. Rumors spread that multiple royals, including young members of the family, were being moved to Balmoral under protective cover. The threat wasn't physical. It was emotional, symbolic. The monarchy wasn't under siege from protesters. It was under siege from its own silence. In the face of unprecedented public emotion, Buckingham Palace stood frozen, paralyzed by the weight of what it could not yet reveal. But as tension surged and the crowd refused to disperse, all eyes turned toward one figure, the mother, the compass, the only one who could speak without needing to say a word. But while the world searched for clarity, one final royal voice prepared to break the silence. Catherine. She didn't speak, but her silence screamed louder than any press release. Catherine, the nation's quiet pillar, emerged dressed not in mourning, but in defiance. What she wore, where she stood, what she held in her hand. It wasn't a statement. It was a battle cry for her child. The public had waited days for a sign, any sign that the monarchy had not turned its back on its people. And then, without warning, Catherine appeared. Not at the palace, not at a press conference, but at a children's hospice on the outskirts of London. Far from the cameras, far from the scripts, there was no entourage, no fanfare, just her, and a silence more powerful than any headline. The blue dress she wore was not accidental. That exact shade, deep, soft, and royal, was Prince Louis's favorite. A quiet tribute only those closest to the family would recognize, and it was noticed instantly. Pinned to her chest was the Queen Mother's brooch. Not seen in public for years, it had been promised privately to Princess Charlotte on her 10th birthday. Yet now it sat gleaming over Catherine's heart. A symbol of legacy, of continuity, of women in the monarchy, refusing to be erased or ignored. Every gesture, every thread, every silent glance, it all carried weight. But the object in her hand sparked the most speculation. A folded parchment, visibly creased and clutched tightly, never leaving her grip. Some said it was a prayer. Others whispered it was a letter. But insiders confirmed what few dared to imagine, that the handwriting on that worn paper belonged to Louise. It was something he'd written during his stay at the private hospital. Words that Catherine had read, memorized, and now carried like a shield. She made her way to the chapel within the hospice grounds where no cameras were allowed. And when she emerged minutes later, the parchment was gone. Eyewitnesses confirmed it had been placed inside the altar, not offered to God as surrender, but as plea. A mother's final request to a monarchy struggling to find its soul. No words were spoken to the press, no statement released by Kensington Palace, but the message was deafening. During her private time with the terminally ill children inside, witnesses described her as kind, present, but deeply reflective. She smiled through tears. She held hands a little too long. She stayed a little too late. One staff member reported seeing her pause in the hallway, stare at a painting of a dove, and whisper under her breath, "Let them never forget who he is." It wasn't a photo op. It was a goodbye. Only she knew how to give. What Catherine did that day wasn't performative. It wasn't PR. It was protest wrapped in maternal grief and royal symbolism. She wasn't begging for sympathy. She was demanding dignity for her child, for her family, for the future of a monarchy walking the razor's edge between relevance and ruin. And as the world grieved with her, the king was preparing his final act. The letter that would turn whispers into history. He didn't consult advisors. He didn't rehearse his words. This wasn't a statement. It was a father's farewell. In a letter destined never to be read aloud, King Charles poured the truth onto paper. Not for the nation, but for his son. And with it, he let go of the illusion that they could return to what once was. For months, Charles had watched his family splinter in silence, holding on to the hope that a private reconciliation with Harry was still possible. Even as public tensions escalated, even as institutional decisions hardened, he clung to the idea that beneath the legal disputes and headlines, the boy he raised still remained. But Catherine's quiet defiance and Louis's fading smile had forced clarity. The crown could no longer wait on sentiment, and Charles could no longer remain quiet. The letter was written by hand in the early hours of morning after he returned from a private chapel vigil. Not a single palace aide was allowed to see it. No legal oversight, no edits, just pen to paper, from father to son. It was Charles not as king, not as sovereign, but as a man stripped bare by loss. The contents, later confirmed by a source close to the royal household, began with memories innocent ones. Holidays in Balmoral, laughing in the gardens, reading by candlelight, when the power once failed during a storm. It was a return to the years before duty and defiance split their bond. But then the tone shifted. Charles admitted what the world suspected, but what he had never said aloud. That he had waited too long. That he had chosen diplomacy over confrontation, silence over risk, that he let the damage grow, believing love alone would be enough to bring Harry back. And in doing so, he failed not just as a king, but as a father. Then came the line that, according to palace insiders, broke him as he wrote it. He shared that Louis, in his soft and faltering voice, had once asked him quietly, "Why doesn't Uncle Harry come to see me anymore?" It wasn't an accusation, just a child's question, simple, honest, devastating. Charles couldn't answer it then, but in the letter he tried. The final paragraph was firm, yet filled with grief. "The door remains open, but only to the son I once knew." No signature, no title, just the seal of the crown pressed into wax and a name written across the envelope in his own hand. Henry, not Harry. Henry, the name he was born with before the stage, before the divide, before the crown became something to flee from. The letter was delivered by a private royal courier directly to California. No intermediaries, no coordination with staff. It arrived without announcement, without warning. Meghan's team responded days later, not with a call, not with a letter of her own, but with a legal brief citing reputational impact, breach of privacy, and formal distancing from unsanctioned familial correspondence. There was no acknowledgement of the man who had written it, no nod to the boy who had asked. As Charles sealed the letter, another document was being finalized in London, one that would ensure this tragedy would never repeat. No more silence, no more waiting. The monarchy struck back not with cruelty, but with clarity. A sweeping new protocol now stands between the crown and those who would commercialize its legacy. And as it passed into law, one name was erased forever. The Royal Legacy Protection Act, dubbed privately within palace corridors as Windsor's New Wall, wasn't drafted in haste. It had been building for months, quietly, methodically, out of sight. But in the wake of Louis's fragile condition, the family's implosion, and the final silence from Harry, it became more than policy. It became necessity. A firewall was now required not just to preserve tradition, but to protect the monarchy's very identity from erosion by brand warfare. At its core, the Act redefined what it meant to be royal in the modern world. Titles once held for life, inherited like heirlooms, would now be subject to recurring review. Every 5 years, each active royal would undergo a private audit to ensure alignment with crown values. No longer could one stand beside the throne while selling access to its image. The past had allowed ambiguity. This law did not. In one of its most decisive clauses, the Act banned the use of royal emblems and heraldic symbols in any commercial capacity post-abdication or withdrawal from duties. The Sussex crest, the Cambridge motif, the Windsor royal cipher, all now protected under new digital intellectual property designations. Unauthorized use wouldn't just be frowned upon, it would be actionable globally. But the Act didn't stop at restriction. It restructured the future. Prince George, still a boy in the eyes of the world, was formally assigned the ceremonial role of legacy ambassador, a newly established position intended to ensure one voice in each generation would uphold the monarchy's integrity from within. It bypassed older protocols, even skipping over certain senior royals to symbolize that the monarchy was evolving consciously and with purpose. Lady Louise, whose loyalty had never wavered despite the chaos around her, was finally granted the long-delayed title of Duchess of Edinburgh. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a signal that quiet service still had value in a royal family, often overshadowed by spectacle. And with that title came responsibilities, new patronages, regional duties, and a firm place at the decision-making table. Then came the most controversial provision. Meghan's entire network of branding entities across publishing, entertainment, wellness, and merchandising was formally barred from referencing the word Sussex in any context that implied royalty or sovereign approval. Legal teams in the UK and US were put on standby. Notices were dispatched. Licensing agreements were quietly renegotiated. The era of Monetizing royal ties was officially over. And in the deepest part of the royal archives, the vault known only to the most trusted stewards, another name was added to a list that had remained untouched for nearly a century. The Ceased Titles vault now held 3 names. The newest one added just this week. Its inscription read simply, Duchess of Sussex, revoked by sovereign will. This wasn't vengeance. This was order restored. And so as the frost settles over Windsor, one truth remains. The crown may bend, but it does not break. Not in public, not in silence, and never again without consequence. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next.